Good afternoon, everyone, and a very warm welcome to the uh, second invited seminar in this season of the BDBC invited seminars. We're very lucky to have with us today Dr. Suren Bhaskarapy from ARI, and I think he's going to touch upon something that is really crucial for us to know that we do not get to know, and that is where all of us are doing a developmental biology or interested in it right now. Who were the people and what were the circumstances that actually contributed to where we are right now? And though there are lots of this cross-pollination internationally, the Indian community studying developmental biology has been around for a while, and I think it's good to know that for us, because a lot of textbooks don't have that. So we are very lucky to have with us Dr. Surendra Bhaskarapy to shed light on that. And can I ask Raj to introduce our speaker for today, please?
Yeah, thanks, Dhananjay. Actually, you've done a fairly good job of introducing Surendra yourself. Okay, but so I want to say I'm really happy that Surendra accepted our invitation to talk to us on the second BDBC seminar series. As Dhananjay has already said, I think that developmental biology is kind of undergoing some kind of crystallization and renaissance in India at the moment. But we should never forget that developmental biology isn't new in India. It's been going on for a long time. And one of the people who's been there to see it since, I guess, the mid-80s, Surendra, is that correct? Yeah.
The 80s.
Yeah, is Surendra Gaspadi from ARI in Pune. Born and bred Pune person, Puneite.
Ahmednagar and Pune. I'll come to that sometime in the talk.
Okay, I shouldn't. Yeah, no spoilers. Sorry, I should have said spoilers.
No.
Yeah. And so I am really happy you're all here. Thanks for joining us, and thank you, Surendra, for agreeing to talk to us. Surendra, as you may all know, also does research as well, and fantastic research. He is looking at Hydra development, one of the simplest model systems we can look at. I will hand over to Sonia now, who has some housekeeping. Is that right, Sonia? Or do we...
Actually, no. We're going to go straight over to Suren, and then I will do some...
okay, sorry.
Not housekeeping, announcements for things to come towards the end.
Okay.
Yeah. So over to you,
fantastic.
Suren.
Okay. So let me, I'll do a little bit of housekeeping. So if you have questions that you think of during the talk, then please put them in the Q&A box. Sukriti and Ayanti will moderate the discussions at the end of the talk. I will put up a link to a Hangout after the talk is done, and so anyone who wants to come and hang out and chat some more, you're most welcome to. Okay, so Surendra, thank you very much for being here. I'm going to hand it over to you. Okay. Thank you.
Right. Well, thank you very much, Raj, and let me share my screen. Okay, so thank you very much for this invitation, Bangalore Developmental Biology Club. It's a great honor, especially to speak after Scott Gilbert. Not very comfortable idea to be sandwiched as a speaker between Scott Gilbert and Nipam Patel, but it's okay, I will give it a try. So I'm going to talk about some history of developmental biology in India, and then go over to our work in hydrobiology. So I have met many inspiring developmental biologists and mentors over the last 40 years since I came to Pune to do research. I will say something about the work of 4 people who initially influenced my career: Professor Leela Mollerkar, Professor Shivtosh Mukherjee, Professor Niazi, and Professor Mohan T. H. Badi. but there were many others who also sort of, I have been watching them, and they are kind of mentors. I never did a formal postdoc in the conventional sense, but I spent a year with Professor Sohan Modak at Pune University. So all these other people actually whom I am going to mention are really my postdoc mentors. I'm still doing my postdoc, I believe. Initially, I thought I made this talk, part of this talk, in a meeting which Maitri Narasimha and Mahendra Sonawne had organized as a Mahabadeshwar seminar in Alibag in 2017. After that, a couple of years after that, the International Journal of Developmental Biology came out with a special issue on developmental biology in India. And Vidyanand Nanjudaya then asked me to write a couple of historical short stories. And finally, Sonia, got in touch with me and said that if you can talk something about history of developmental biology and your own work. So that is how I have prepared this talk. These are essentially personal impressions. So I'm not a trained historian. So there may be some people who are not mentioned here. That is not the intention. But the people that I mentioned, I have met personally, and they have influenced my career over the last 4 decades. So first part will be about those mentors. And in the next part, I'll tell you about Hydra as a research organism and just a flavor of our work in Hydra biology. So firstly, I'll talk about Professor Leela Mullerkar. Teaching and research in experimental embryology, as you can see on the screen, was initiated by her when she returned to India after completing her doctorate with Professor C.H. Waddington in Edinburgh. That was in the mid to late 50s. She was already in her early 40s by then. She was teaching in a college in Pune, but she got a scholarship from the government of India and went to Edinburgh for her PhD. And later on, she joined the Pune University, which is now known as Savitribai Phule Pune University, and started experimental embryology course there. She started making use of locally available animals, obviously, because she had to do practical exercises. So chick, frog, toad, garden lizard, mollusk embryos, as well as sponges and hydra. And she, because she worked for her PhD on chick embryo development, she extensively used chick embryo in her teaching and research. Also, the other reason was that time the thalidomide tragedy had struck. Thalidomide created a lot of limb abnormalities in human children. And that is why suddenly teratology became very popular and very important. And she carried out a lot of work on to find out mechanism of action of several chemicals. She initially worked with very small facilities like kerosene incubators and so on. But she published a number of papers in Journal of Embryology Experimental Morphology, which we know as Development today, as well as in Roos Archives of Developmental Biology. These two journals were very popular then for developmental biologists. And she consistently published in these two journals, in spite of having not terribly good facilities. Then in 1977, along with a colleague of hers in Pune University, Dr. Suresh C. Goyal, who unfortunately left us very early, she, and along with some other senior people, she formed the Indian Society of Developmental Biologists, which we know as INSDB. So this is how Mullerkar started a master's course in experimental embryology. And her work was, she started doing her PhD in Edinburgh, in Waddington's lab. And this is an abstract that I got from Edinburgh. They have an excellent library there, studies in the processes of determination in chick embryo. And she submitted this abstract somewhere in November 1956. Her PhD work was about how the areas around the Hensen's node. So Hensen's node, which is shown in the right-hand side here, was confirmed as equivalent to the Spearman's organizer by Waddington himself in 1932. And what Mullerkar wanted to find out was whether the area around the Hensen's node can also induce new access. And so she carried out experiments with the chick embryo. Chick embryo, please appreciate that it's a very tiny structure. It has about 2 millimeters long primitive streak, and anterior part of the primitive streak is the Hinsen's node, equivalent to the Stevens organizer in frog embryo. So Mullerkar actually made grafts of these tissues around the Hinsen's node, and in all she made 303 grafts, out of which 270 she examined biologically. Please remember, we are talking about the mid-50s, and the dissections and the grafting would have been very difficult that time. She used tungsten needles and then cut 0.3 millimeter pieces around the Hinsen's node, and then grafted them onto another host embryo and found out what is the inducing capacity of each of the pieces. And she could see that there are actually gradient. So around the Hinsen's node, as you go away from the Hinsen's node, the inducing capacity goes on reducing. So these were very challenging experiments and very successful experiments. And she published a solid paper based on that work in Journal of Embryology and Experimental Morphology. Then she came to India and established her own lab. And I'm just going to show you a few papers that she published from Pune University with those scarce facilities. And all these were published in JEM, Journal of Embryology, Experimental Morphology. So I'm not going to go into details of that, but these were essentially teratological studies. So she also used, post-nodal pieces of the chick embryo. So, things like whether the Hinsen's node itself or the post-nodal pieces or areas around the Hinsen's node have the inducing capacity, and whether teratogens, chemicals that you find in the environment, have an adverse effect on the early development of the chick embryo. She also used mollusk embryos, as you can see on the screen. And then she did a lot of difficult experiments in the sense that apart from her PhD work, they also carried out with her students, she also carried out Hinsen's node graft, and this was, intracoelomic grafting technique. So those who are familiar with chick embryo development will appreciate that these are very difficult experiments. So you take a piece of Hinsen's node, sandwich it between ectoderm taken from anterolateral sides of the node, and graft this entire piece into the coelom of a 2.5-day ovum. So, and then grow it for several days. So these are very challenging experiments. And this paper, for example, was published in 1972. So all this research she used for her teaching also, and she often brought, I'm told that she often brought the recent issues of JEM to her classes and taught students what was happening at that time all over the world. So that was Mullerkar's contribution to, teaching in developmental biology, formal teaching in developmental biology for the first time. So these are a couple of pictures that I got from her time in Edinburgh. The one on the left, for example, you see that it is from an album that was presented to Professor Waddington on his 50th birthday by the Edinburgh staff. You can see Mullerkar on the left, and on the right you see Bob Edwards, who had completed a PhD just a couple of years before Mullerkar and went on to win the Nobel Prize in 2010 for in vitro fertilization. On the right you see Waddington when he actually visited Pune University Zoology Department. And so she kept in touch with the Edinburgh group and continued to publish from India. In 1993, she was felicitated by her students and colleagues. This meeting was organized by Sohan Modak and Jayan Pal in Pune. And many developmental biologists visited to, grace the occasion. You can see Sunio Yamada, Ruth Bellers is here on the top, chick embryologist. Then you see John Gurdon and Jim Smith here also who came. You see Eyal Gilady. I don't know if the youngsters know about Eyal Gilady. You are all familiar with the Hamburger-Hamilton stages of chick embryo development, but Eyal Gilady is the one who staged the chick embryos before the egg was laid. So these stages, Eyal Gilady stages, are given in Roman numerals, unlike the Hamburger-Hamilton stages, which are given in Arabic numerals. There was another person who also trained in Waddington's lab, and that was Professor Shivtosh Mukherjee. Just a few years before Leela Mullerkar, he completed his PhD. He worked on the notochord development of the chick embryo, especially the sheath of the notochord. And then he came back and spent time in Calcutta and New Delhi. But after coming back, he chose to work on sponges and hydra. And he did quite a lot of original work in that, and this is just a glimpse of 3 of his papers. He has published a lot of papers on spawn cell reaggregation, hydra regeneration. You also see a paper here in 1984 paper. This is Somdatta Sinha, who was with Professor Mukherjee and later on was a scientist at CCMB. I believe she has gone back to Calcutta now and teaches at IISER Kolkata. Then I come to Professor Niazi's work. So there was a meeting that Vidyanand Nanjundaya organized in Mysore in 1995 to sort of celebrate Professor Niazi's work. And what you see in this slide, this is an article Professor Tokindo Okada, who was then the president of the International Society of Developmental Biology, who came to Mysore, and he wrote a sort of review article on regeneration studies to bring out the contributions of Professor Niazi and Professor Mohanty Hejmadi. So right from in the beginning, the first demonstration of regeneration in animals was done in 1744 in Hydra, and I'll come to it a little later in slight detail. But you can notice here with the green and the red arrow that Niazi actually showed the induction of abnormal limb regeneration because of vitamin A in anuran tadpoles, amphibian tadpoles, and Mohanty Hejmadi showed heteromorphic regeneration. So briefly, this is the paper that Okada published in Journal of Biosciences, and he brought out the importance of the work of Niazi and Mohanty Hejmadi. And as you can see here, Niazi's work was important from the point of replication of pattern during regeneration, and he used retinoic acid as a tool to understand that. And later on, a few years after that, Mohanty Hejmadi's group showed that if you treat the the regenerating tail, the tadpole whose tail is regenerating, you get homeotic transformation, you get development of limbs. So this paper was published in Nature, and you can see here Mohanty Hejmadi is in the center. On the right is Sushil Datta, on the left is Pravati Mahapatra. And they published this in 1992, and it made a lot of news that time because you clearly see the development of legs at the place of developing tail. There were a couple of reports saying that people could not repeat this experiment, and therefore then Mohanty Hejmadi's group went on to repeat these experiments in several species of frogs. And these are some pictures I got from Sushil Datta, which you can see that in various different species of frogs, they got homeotic transformation because of retinoic acid. So these are some of the stories that I used to hear as a student. And as I mentioned, there was a meeting in Mysore. You can see in the top right photograph, you see Professor Niazi right at the center. On his right is Tokindo Okada, and on his left is Tokindo Okada, and then Mohanty Hejmadi on his left. On the right of Professor Niazi is Malcolm Madden, who has done original work on effect of retinoic acid in limb regeneration, and also Yasuda from Japan. So we had a great meeting in 1995, and the Journal of Biosciences came out with a special issue on the meeting in 1996. So this discovery of Professor Niazi, we have now reproduced his paper that he wrote for the Mysore meeting, a very detailed account of how he started to work with retinoic acid in regeneration, and that we reproduced in a special issue of International Journal of Developmental Biology last year with a short commentary, Professor Nanjundaya and myself. Professor Niazi also helped me write a short brief history of INSDB in the same issue, and you can go and read it there, because Professor Niazi was present when actually the society was formed. He was one of the founding members. Professor Niazi lives in Delhi. He is running 95 now, and only a couple of months back, I got a pleasant surprise. He called me, he gave me a video call on WhatsApp. So Professor Niazi, if he's watching, then I wish him good health. So Professor Niazi is one of the founder members who wrote this article, helped me write this article. So this special issue of International Journal of Developmental Biology has about 25 articles, as you can see, and I suggest that you read it. It has been published in 2 issues. It has become rather thick, and therefore the journal was insistent that they publish it in two volumes. they have combined 6 numbers of that from January to June. So you will see some introductory articles, person-centered accounts, surveys, and original research papers. And those who are interested in developmental biology should go and see, look at these issues. Of course, we could not cover everything that goes on in India because, sometimes we didn't find the right people, sometimes people didn't respond or so on. But it's a good account of what went on and what is going on in developmental biology. So this is essentially Vidyanand Nanjundaya got an invitation to edit this issue. And I don't know, for some reason, he asked me to assist him in this endeavor. And it was a great thing for me, a great learning experience, because Vidyanand Nanjundaya has been an editor of Journal of Biosciences and is a wonderful editor. And therefore, that was a great learning experience. Vidyanand Nanjundaya, you can see here in 1996, when he visited Agharkar Research Institute. I believe that in the last quarter of a century, he has not changed much. But Vidya has, also organized a number of scientific meetings from which many of us, that time young people, have benefited greatly. I'll just show you a couple or 3 pictures of meetings. So he had organized a meeting in Nainital in 1998, which was about concepts and models in developmental biology, and gave students and young PIs like me a chance to interact with several developmental biologists. So I'll just show you, point out some people here. So from left sitting, you can see Professor Lakhotia, Yasuda, Stuart Newman, Professor Niazi. John Bonner was there, and we spent excellent time with him about dicty. Then Okada. Then this is Nicole Lidwarin, who did the chick quail chimeras for the first time. She transplanted quail tissues onto chick embryo and vice versa. And because they show a different kind of Olgan reaction, you can find out where the cells, the transplanted cells, end up in the host embryo. So excellent experiment. She was there. Vidya. Then John Gurdon was there. There was Apurva Sarin, some familiar faces you will see. Apurva Sarin, Rini Borges, Mahadevan, Anuranjan, and so many of these. So it was for about 8 days, as you can see, and it was an excellent opportunity for all of us to interact with these people and discussing things. The other meeting I attended that Vidya organized was on genetic determinism in Sikkim. And that was also very illuminating for people like us. And once again, you see some very accomplished biologists here. You have John Gurdon, Vidya, then you have Michael Bate, Obed Siddiqui, Patrick Bateson, Stuart Newman, and so on. You have Thelma here, then Reni Borges, Rita Mullerkar, Manjrekar, who left us unfortunately too early, Kasbekar, Pradeep Verma, and so on. So it was, so I personally benefited a lot, and many of my contemporaries also found this an excellent opportunity. There was also another forum from which many of us benefited greatly, and that was the Mahabaleshwar seminars. So these were initially started in 1975 by TIFR and Ahmednagar College. Ahmednagar is about 100 kilometers away from Pune, and I'm a student of Ahmednagar College. I did my MSc there, and I was taught by Professor John Barnabas, whom you can see here along with Obed, and his wife Shama taught me zoology. And very early in my career, I started attending, I got the opportunity to attend Mahabaleshwar seminars. My first one was exactly 40 years back when I was a graduate student, and this was on membrane biology. I think it was put together by Professor Balram. And I think M.K. Matthew from NCBS was also a graduate student, and he also came over. Then in 1987, another very excellent seminar I could attend in Mahabaleshwar. This was Molecular Evolution, and we had excellent speakers like Cyril Ponnam Peruma and Drew Knoll and so on. So very nice setting there also, because Ahmednagar College had an estate there, Green Hill campus, where the seminars were used to be held. Then in 2004 was my most rewarding Mahabaleshwar seminar, which I helped Veronica Rodriguez organize in Mahabaleshwar Club in Mahabaleshwar. And some excellent speakers and teachers were there. The next year was another seminar, Molecules to Networks and Behavior 2005. This, I think, was also organized by Veronica along with Krishnan. We sort of provided logistic support from Pune. And I think this is where I met Shubha today and Vidita Vaidya for the first time. Then in 2010, once again, I helped Krishnan, Jayant Udgavkar and Mani Ramaswamy organize a seminar in Mahabaleshwar. And finally, I attended another Mahabaleshwar seminar, this time in Alibag, organized by Maitri and Mahendra. That's where I first spoke about history of developmental biology in India. So these Mahabaleshwar seminars over the years has given a chance to youngsters to interact with accomplished scientists from all over the world, and has really widened our outlook. This is just one picture from the 2004 seminar on evolutionary developmental biology that was organized by Veronica Rodriguez. You can see here on the left, I have put an arrow there. You can also see some very familiar faces like Amitabh Joshi, David Weisblatt, who has done excellent work on leech development. Then you have Nipam Patel here. On the extreme left is Rakesh Mishra. On the top, in the top row is Shashidhara from currently from Ashoka. Then these two ladies whom I have put in a rectangle are my colleagues from Agarkar Research Institute. Kantimati Kulkarni, who's on the left, is a geologist, and Veronica, when she visited Agarkar, she saw the spectacular collection of fossils from there, and she was keen that we carry some fossils there. So we carried a carload of fossils to Mahabaleshwar Club and displayed them there, which really created a nice atmosphere there. So Veronica Rodriguez has been very supportive, and she has been a great friend, left us too early, unfortunately. But when I got my first major grant from ACRB on Hydra, she was the chairperson. She also examined the first Hydra doctoral thesis from my lab, and I think she was very supportive. She was an excellent mentor, very upright scientist, and so on. All of you know her probably better than I do, and it was a very rewarding experience in Mahabaleshwar. Then I'll just mention a couple more meetings that we organized in Pune. So these I organized along with Shashidhara on models when in 2006 when Agarkar was celebrating its Diamond Jubilee. And you can see some excellent speakers. This was essential on models in developmental biology. So Claudio Stern, Olivier Porcoy, Maitri, Sandhya Kaushika, Makoto Asashima, Weisblatt, Professor Lakotia, Rakesh, Jim Smith, Agata, who worked on planaria, Shashi, Thomas Bosch, who works on Hydra, Satyajit Rath, and we had the excellent poster sessions as well as cultural sessions there. And the other meeting that I organized once again along with Shashi was in 2008, wherein this was in cell biology and stem cell biology, for which John Gurdon, Jeetu Mayer, Imran, Jyotsna, Professor Sohan Modak, and all this Mahadevan, all these people were there. Why I'm showing you these pictures is because, as I said, continuous interaction with these people and the legacy that is left behind by stalwarts like Mullerkar, Niazi, and so on, has helped people like me to design their research. Finally, I come to a meeting in 2012, which again Vidyanan organized in Almora, and this was on individuals and groups. And as usual, you see excellent sessions in the hall, then excellent setting, natural setting here. You have sightseeing, you have the inevitable evening discussions, which became very serious after a couple of hours and so on. But on our way back, we stayed for a day and a half at a place called Naukuchi-Atal. Naukuchi-Atal means nine-cornered lake, which is not too far from Bhimtal. And when we finished the morning tea, as you can see in this picture, I like this picture because it's a nice picture. Plus, soon after finishing this morning cup of tea, I went to the lake just behind and spent a couple of hours looking for some Hydra. Unfortunately, I couldn't locate any, so I took a few Hydrilla twigs, put them in an empty water bottle, took some water from the lake, and decided to take it back to Pune. On the way, I stayed for a day in National Institute in Immunology and looked for some Hydra in Satyajit Rath's lab, and I just couldn't find any. I was a bit frustrated, but then Satyajit suggested that I take it to Pune. As usual, Satyajit's suggestions turned out to be excellent, And in Pune, one student after 3 days found one polyp in that water, which was, very stressed out and starved and so on. But the Hydra gang in the lab took care of that polyp. And we now have thousands of them. We call it Naukuchia strain. And this picture is of those polyps. I think they look more beautiful because they are from pristine environments. But today I'm not going to talk about this strain of Hydra, but a different strain which is from Pune. So let me now move over to Hydra. And this is a picture, from Greek mythology, wherein you can see King Hercules trying to kill the multi-headed Hydra. So Hydra, if you take a vertical cut on Hydra head, it develops into 2 heads. If you take 2 cuts, it develops into 4 heads and so on. So it becomes multi-headed. And unfortunately, because of this ability, it has picked up its name from a monster in Greek mythology. But believe me, there is nothing monstrous about Hydra, except probably to its prey. It's a very delicate and nice organism. So before I go to Hydra, let me just acknowledge all this work on Hydra over the last 20 years has been done at Agarkar Research Institute, which has been very supportive. Today, I'm going to talk only a small part of cell signaling in Hydra, which is mainly carried out by Kalpana and Surekha. Mauli has looked for some receptor tyrosine kinases in Hydra, and Anuprita has looked at FGF and VEGF, which I'm not going to talk about. These are different people who have worked in the lab over the years. Jim Smith was, of course, a visitor. Okay, you can see him here. So I just decided to put these pictures because they have all been wonderful people in the lab, and they are the ones who do the work, as I said, and I get the chance to talk in the Developmental Biology Club of Bangalore. And these are all the funding agencies. Now let me come to how Hydra was discovered by science. This was done in 1744 by a gentleman, Abraham Tremblay, whose picture you can see. Abraham Tremblay was actually a mathematician interested in infinity, but his hobby was to look for aquatic insects. And apparently that time the heads of the departments and the directors of the institute did not mind if people carried out their hobbies. So Abraham Tremblay used to look for aquatic insects. And once during his collection, he found some strange white tubes floating in the water. So he brought them to the laboratory, and you can see that picture of Hydra here in the left beaker. And he also used to show it to his pupils. And these pictures are, this picture and this picture are from his own Tremblay's monograph, which he published in 1744. But see this, he actually cut his first polyp on 25th of November 1740, as written in his monograph, and then the 2 pieces regenerated fully in a few days. So this was the first demonstration of regeneration in animals. And in the last 200 and more than 200 years, we hardly, 280 years, we hardly know anything about how Hydra regenerates. So it's so tough to find out. It's a challenge, and it would be wonderful if some of the youngsters who are attending today get excited by this kind of a problem. What Abraham Tremblay did was not only to discover regeneration in animals for the first time, but he brought these aquatic animals to the lab for the first time. Till then, people brought only terrestrial animals to the lab. So what Tremblay did was, for the first time, he brought an aquatic organism to the lab. He cultured, maintained it for several days. He did experimentation with it, and he found it so strange that he actually used the postal service to transport it to different labs. So this was the first time ever that an aquatic organism could be cultured or maintained in the lab. And that is known as the Tremblay effect, or the birth of marine zoology. So the first time people started using aquatic organisms. By the way, Hydra is a freshwater organism, not a marine not a saltwater organism. And it caught the imagination of people in Europe that time. And several people visited Tremblay, and it became a fashion to say that, yeah, I have seen the polyp, I have seen Tremblay's polyp. And there were, a naturalist painter actually came out with a supplement on the polyp with so many pages, and figures of Hydra were shown depicted as human characteristics, dancing figures, and so on. So it really caught the imagination of people that time in Europe, and a new organism was given to science. So these are Hydra in the lab. I have taken a random picture with my mobile. This is Hydra vulgaris. We called it in Pune strain because these are all clones of a single polyp that I collected in the year 2000 from a pond in Pune University. And the other species which is prevalent in India is the green Hydra, Hydra viridissima, and it looks green because it has chlorella as endosymbionts. So these are the two Hydra that we usually get in India. We do most of our work, or almost all of our work, with the brown Hydra or the in Pune strain of Hydra. So let me quickly tell you about Hydra. So this is the in Pune strain on the left, you can see. And so Hydra has a oral aboral axis and a radial axis like a starfish. It has the head, the body column, and the foot. In some species of Hydra, you get a stalk-like structure, which is known as peduncle, which is not present in the Indian Hydra. Hydra is a diploblast. Unlike us, we are triploblast, you know. So Hydra does not have mesoderm. It has ectoderm and endoderm. It has gastric region as shown in the figure on the right. It has tentacles surrounding a mouth opening. There is only one opening to the body, and it is located on the top of a conical structure known as hypostome. Hydra feeds through this opening, and since that is the only opening, undigested food is also thrown out of the same opening. To look at some more details of Hydra, you can see here the ectoderm is on the right and the endoderm is on the left. The two are separated by a modified basement membrane called mesoglia. And Hydra has about 20 to 25 different kinds of cells. We have about 200. Hydra is made up of about 100,000 cells. We are made up of trillions of cells. So as compared to us, it is a much simpler organism structurally. The outer ectoderm is shown in green, the inner endoderm is shown in pink. In addition to ectodermal epithelial cells and endodermal epithelial cells, there are several different kinds of cells. Nematocytes, for example, which is the characteristic feature of the phylum Cnidaria, to which Hydra belongs. The other members of Cnidaria are, you know, jellyfish, corals, and so on. It has neurons, sensory neurons, ganglionic neurons. It has gland cells, mucus cells in the endoderm. So these are the different kinds of cells that you find in Hydra. So these two layers are separated by modified basement membrane. There is no mesoderm in Hydra. It's a diploblast. When people studied carefully the cellular dynamics of Hydra, and I hope you can see the red lines and the days that are mentioned. So the cells in the middle of the body column here continuously proliferate and move towards the two extremities. They either go towards the hypostome or they go towards the basal disc. And in about 20 days, as you can see in the figure, they are sloughed off. They undergo apoptosis and are sloughed off from the body. Remaining cells go to the buds. I forgot to mention that Hydra usually reproduces by budding, by asexual means of reproduction. But if conditions become unfavorable, such as starving or change in temperature, they can go for sexual reproduction also, in which case they will develop gonads. So these cells continuously proliferate and move towards the two extremities. As they move, they also get differentiated. And in about 20 days, a cell is thrown out of the body. So, and the blue cells which you see in the tentacles of the mother polyp, of the bud, and the foot of the mother polyp, or the basal disc by which it attaches to the substratum, the blue cells are the really terminally differentiated cells. All other cells are capable of dividing. They undergo mitosis. And so at any given point, you don't see older cells in Hydra. They are only about 20 days old. And therefore, probably Hydra escapes organismal senescence, and also it is considered to be potentially immortal organism. Okay. And since it shows certain characteristics of the vertebrate embryo, for example, like cell proliferation, cell adhesion, cell differentiation, cell motility, cell death, and so on, it is also known as a perpetual embryo. So you can study several embryonic phenomena in an adult organism in Hydra. That's the peculiarity. And this adding of cells happens because Hydra has three very distinct stem cell populations, which are shown on the right. I hope you can see it. So the ectodermal and the endodermal epithelial stem cells are shown in yellow, the big yellow cell on the top left. And these are the ones which not only act as somatic cells in the form of epithelium, but they also can undergo mitosis. So they are stem cells and somatic cells at the same time. Probably we are looking at a step in evolution, I don't know. But they can divide as well as work as epitheliums. They recycle in about 3 to 4 days. And when they become terminally differentiated in tentacles and basal disc, they are shown in blue, as you can see in the two figures. But all the other cells of the body, other than the epithelia, come from a third stem cell population, which are known as interstitial cells, or eye cells for short. These are located in the body column, and they cycle very fast. In 1.5 days, they divide, and they can give rise to different kinds of neurons. They can give rise to different kinds of nematocytes. Hydra has 4 different kinds of nematocytes, and this feature is often used in taxonomic identification of Hydra. They can also give rise to gland and mucus cells, but amazingly, the same stem cell can also give rise to the germ cells, like egg and sperm, if the need arises. So it's a truly multipotent stem cell population, and people always wonder and try to compare the stem cells of Hydra and the stem cells of organisms which are more complex. The other feature of Hydra, which excites developmental biologists and biologists in general, is regeneration. So this is one experiment done in the lab a long time back. If you cut an adult Hydra into 3 pieces, all the 3 pieces regenerate to a full polyp. So the middle piece can actually regenerate both the head and the foot, and regenerate. Takes a little longer than the other 2 pieces, but it regenerates into a full polyp. So Hydra has this tremendous capacity of regeneration, and this gives an experimenter or any biologist or naturalist a chance to study many things like regeneration, pattern formation, how cells interact with each other, how they talk to each other, the signaling part, and so on, and then how these different structures arise properly at the proper site. So to summarize Hydra regeneration, I picked up a figure from Hans Bode's review. Hans Bode has done tremendous work in Hydra biology. So in figure A, you can see that if you cut a Hydra into 2 pieces, the top piece will regenerate the lost foot, the lower piece will regenerate the lost head. But you will notice that the regenerated pieces are smaller than the original Hydra, and that is because, to begin with, in case of Hydra, there is no cell proliferation. So it is a morpholactic type of regeneration, which means that to begin with, there is no cell proliferation, there is no growth, and you end up getting a smaller Hydra. This is very different than regeneration in limbs or tail of amphibians and lizards, wherein what happens is, if the limb is cut somewhere here, then the cells here undergo dedifferentiation so that they can enter mitosis, and then new cells are formed and the new structures are formed. In case of Hydra, it is morpholactic, while in case of higher organisms like amphibia and lizards, it is known as epimorphosis. In figure B, you can see that the middle piece regenerates. The middle piece regenerates both the head and the foot, and you can do whatever you want with this piece. You can centrifuge it, you can shake it and all that. The head and foot will always regenerate on the original side where they were there. And based on these observations in Hydra, as well as the observation of limb regeneration in chick embryo, Louis Wolpert and all his group actually thought of the theory of morphogen gradients and positional information. So we know that there are molecules here which are head-forming molecules, which always have a higher concentration on the side of the original head and vice versa. So that decides how the proper structures will develop. Please remember that another interesting thing about this is that as soon as the head is formed, those cells also produce a signal which is head inhibitory signal, so that only one head is formed. So it's a very fine-tuned mechanism that occurs there. As I said, you can get a small Hydra if you take a small piece, as you can see in figure D. But people have done even complete disaggregation of Hydra, and from that disaggregated pool, I mean the pellet of Hydra cells, you can still get regenerated Hydra. And the obvious question there would be, how does the head form? Because the gradients are completely disturbed there. And it turns out that there is the wind pathway responsible for specifying the head structures there. I'll come to it a little later. And finally, about Hydra organism, a very interesting experiment was done more than 100 years back by Ethel Brown Harvey, a graduate student. And what she did was she took a small piece from hypostome, okay, and transplanted it on the middle of the body column of a host Hydra, and she got induction of an axis. She did many such experiments, and when she, for example, if you graft this piece near the existing Hydra, it doesn't induce an axis because there are head inhibitory molecules here. But if you transplant it away from the original head, then you get induction of axis. So this tissue, essentially these are groups of cells from hypostome. They have inducing capacity, so they can actually organize a new axis. So Ethel Brown Harvey was the first person to demonstrate organizer-like capacity in an animal. Later on, this she did in 1909. A few years later, Hans Stevens' lab did similar experiments in frog embryos, and as you can see here, that if she transplants the dorsal lipoblastophore of a donor onto the ventral side of a host, then she gets induction of axis there, and you get a twin embryo. There has been a lot of criticism about Professor Speeman, because apparently Speeman had Ethel Brown Harvey's paper in his collection. He had marked also parts of it, but he never cited the paper. So, Ethel Brown Harvey was never on the Nobel Prize, which Speeman got in 1928. Hilde Mangold also unfortunately passed away in a stove accident. She was also not on the Nobel Prize. But then, the organizer concept was first demonstrated in a simple diplomolastic organism like Hydra. Now, in the last part, let me give you a flavor of what we have been doing at Agarkar Research Institute. So we worked on homologs of vertebrate pattern forming gene. By the way, Raj, how am I doing for time?
You have about 10-15 minutes.
Okay, that's fine. Yeah, so we have, all these we have identified from Hydra, Noggin, receptor tyrosine kinases, EGF for the first time from Hydra. Very interesting because Hydra doesn't have mesoderm, doesn't have blood, but still has VEGF, and that we discovered a few years back. We have discovered also the other BMP inhibitor, Gremlin. We have worked on crosstalk between them. DNA repair in Hydra, this happens to be the only lab in the world, surprisingly, which systematically has worked at DNA repair in Hydra, about which I am not going to talk today. Then autophagy, we have looked at Hydra microbiome also and showed that it's important. And we are very proud that we have been trying to introduce Hydra as a teaching tool in India. So today I'm just going to tell you a little bit about our Noggin work, because that is where we started. In year 2000, the Wnt pathway was discovered in Hydra. And therefore, I also thought that we should look at such genes. So let me give you a brief introduction. So while the multicellular organisms are believed to have evolved 700 million years ago, Hydra is estimated to be around for 60 million years. Now, there was a paper in Nature just about a fortnight back, wherein Elizabeth Turner has claimed that she has seen a fossil of sponges, which is 890 million years old. So we go back 190 million in the evolution of multicellular organisms. In any case, these are evolutionarily very ancient organisms. And Hydra is also the first organism known to science that has an organized nervous system. And one of the interests that time in my lab was induction of the nervous system. We used to use chick and frog embryos for that. So I thought that Hydra might be a good model to study neural induction, because it is the first organism to show an organized nervous system. So let me give you a background. This is from D. Roberts' paper. This is a cartoon of the frog embryo. So these cells of the ectoderm, the mesoderm, and the endoderm have BMP signaling as the default signaling pathway. But in the Speeman's organizer, which is shown in green here, there are certain BMP inhibitors secreted, like chordin, noggin, and follistatin, and they play two very critical roles. They dorsalize the structures, so they are responsible for development of the dorsal structures. They are also responsible for induction of the nervous system. And so therefore, we decided to look look if noggin is present in hydra. That's where we started. And by using some Xenopus probes in 2001, we actually saw noggin expression in hydra, and it was specifically expressed in the places where tentacles are formed. And we thought that this points to the possibility of a close molecular similarity between hydra and Xenopus organizers. These were sort of tentative interactions. We didn't have a hydra lab. There was no other lab working on hydra in India at that time. So we used Xenopus probes, which was not a very clean experiment, but we did detect noggin transcripts in hydra. And as expected in the sense that this was not a serious hydra lab, the paper was largely ignored till Hans Meinhardt, who was a theoretical developmental biologist, cited this paper in one of his reviews in Nature Reviews in Neurosciences, and used the presence of noggin in hydra from our paper to advance some of his arguments. And that was kind of a pat on the back. And then I met him in Tutzing, where they hold biennial hydra meetings in 2007 and 2009, and had some discussion and from which we have benefited greatly. He unfortunately passed away in 2016. So later on, in around 2004, a student joined and was prepared to work on hydra. It was a risky project because nobody was working on hydra. Even I didn't know much about it except for a few experiments I did during my PhD there. But Kalpana did detect noggin in hydra, and it showed cysteine residues very characteristic of the noggin family, which are shown in blue here, and other conserved residues also, which are shown in pink. And the C-terminal 9 residues of cysteine, which are very important for noggin function, are all present in hydra. Then she also found that the three-dimensional structure of hydra noggin is very similar to not only to the Nematostela, which is very closely related, but also to Xenopus and human. So we were excited about that, but I didn't know whether hydra is functionally conserved. This only shows that it's structurally conserved. And therefore, we collaborated with Professor Makoto Asashima in Tokyo University. This picture was taken some years back at Assi Ghat in Varanasi. And we discussed with him, and we agreed to do functional assays of the hydra noggin in Xenopus. So once again, this cartoon, if you overexpress these inhibitors in the early frog embryo, you get duplication of axis, okay? And you also get over dorsalization. So we did the same experiment. We overexpressed, we injected hydra noggin mRNA into Xenopus leaves. And as you can see here, this is the negative control. This is the control with Xenopus noggin itself overexpressed. And this is hydra noggin, and you can see in 100% of the cases, we got duplication of axis. We were very excited about this because, it showed a phenotype in a vertebrate embryo. So it was functionally conserved up to vertebrates. But then just to, I was not too sure because this kind of assays were done very routinely then. I was not sure that whether it will impress the reviewer. So I thought of doing another experiment, and the basis of which is this. If you irradiate the early frog embryos with UV, it develops into only ventral structures. And the reason is that for dorsalization, the cortical rotation is essential, which brings beta-catenin to the future dorsal side. And that is inhibited by UV irradiation, and you get a dorsalized embryo. On the other hand, if you overexpress noggin, you get a dorsalized embryo. So you get an entire pattern of ventralization to dorsalization. The tadpole in the middle is the perfect tadpole with a fine balance of dorsal and ventral structures. So I talked to Asashima, Makoto-san, and asked him whether we can do this experiment wherein we irradiate the early embryo with UV and then try to rescue it with hydra noggin as well as Xenopus noggin. Xenopus noggin has a positive control because it's standard experiment. And you can see this is a long, a lot of work summarized in one slide. You can see the uninjected Xenopus tadpoles here. These are the UV irradiated tadpoles, which get ventralized. But along with UV, if you inject hydra noggin or Xenopus noggin, then there is some rescue of phenotype. And therefore, it was a clear-cut proof that hydra noggin is actually not only structurally, but also functionally conserved up to vertebrates. And we confirmed that it is, in fact, the noggin is inhibiting BMP signaling in the animal caps. more recently, we also discovered another BMP inhibitor from Hydra, and that is gremlin. You can see here that gremlin and noggin from Hydra, how it compares with those molecules from different phyla. And you can see that the structures are conserved. We looked at the in situ expression, the localization of the transcript by whole mount in situ hybridization. And in short, we noticed that gremlin seemed to be important, expressed where the budding takes place and the buds detach, while noggin is expressed where the tentacles come up. Okay, you can see that this is summarized here. So to confirm that noggin is indeed important in tentacle formation, we used a pharmacological inhibitor of GSK3 beta in Hydra called alstapolon, which actually upregulates the Wnt pathway, and the entire Hydra polyps become like a head and develops tentacles all over its body. So you can see here that in a Hydra which is treated with alstapolon, noggin actually expression happens wherever the tentacles are coming up. So at this point, we think that noggin, if not important in neural induction, may be important in tentacle formation. Gremlin, on the other hand, does not show any such pattern. You can see the gremlin is expressed everywhere, but not at the spots where tentacles will come up. So this is a sort of summary slide in one of our recent papers. So noggin and gremlin have been discovered by us, and we believe that noggin is important in tentacle patterning, while gremlin is important in budding. I won't go into the details because there is no time today. So this is these are the signaling pathways in Hydra that this is a table from a recent review that I wrote for the special issue. And you can see that this is the contribution from our lab. We have discovered noggin, gremlin, receptor tyrosine kinases, VEGF, and FGF from Hydra. So these are this is what we could do over the last 10-15 years. Lastly, we have also made a Hydra kit, which we supply to different labs in India. We made this because initially I used to supply Hydra to anybody who asked them. But then people actually started calling me in the evenings and saying that tomorrow morning we have a practical exercise. Please arrange Hydra for us. It became a bit too much. People just took Hydra and used them for practicals and threw them away. So now we charge a little bit, about 3,000 rupees, in which we provide Hydra polyps, we provide the Hydra medium, we provide its food. They are fed with Artemia larvae, so we provide cysts and rock salt to make artificial seawater so that you can hatch out the Artemia cysts. So I think it's a very good model system to teach in schools, college. I have taken it to schools, cut the Hydra, showed regeneration over the next 2 days in schools, and students know about several biological phenomena by looking at this simple organism. So far, we don't need ethical clearance from Animal Ethics Committee for this, and I think it should be used. There are many universities and colleges in Maharashtra which have introduced Hydra regeneration as a practical course. So I think it should be spread more. It is an excellent organism to be used for teaching, for short research projects, summer projects, and so on. So finally, these are the 3 recent reviews that whoever is interested in knowing more about Hydra, this is a review in Resonance, which I wrote last year. This is for beginners actually and for teachers. Then about the cell signaling molecules in Hydra, which is come in the special issue. And there is something else which I have not talked about at all. But as I mentioned earlier, ours is the only lab which works on DNA repair in Hydra. And this has been recently reviewed by us just a couple of months back in Frontiers in Genetics. And I invite all those who are interested in reading it. This work essentially has been carried out by 2 graduate students from my lab, Apurva Barve and Alisha Galande. And the graduate student from my collaborator's lab, Komal Pekle, and that collaborator is Saroj Gaskardi, who's in university. Actually, it was because of Saroj's interest in DNA repair, which he has been studying from her PhD days, that we thought of looking at DNA repair in Hydra, and it has been an extremely rewarding experience. We have all the xeroderma pigmentosum genes in Hydra, and recently we have shown that they can rescue human cells which are defective in XP proteins. And finally, let me summarize in this slide. Mullerkar worked on teratogenesis, morphogenesis, pattern formation. She used the local material. Shivtosh Mukherjee worked on Hydra and sponges. Professor Niazi and Professor Mohanty Ejmadi used retinoic acid to find out very essential things in limb regeneration in anneurons. And along with all those pictures that I showed, all those mentors that have, we took tentative steps in Agarkar Research Institute on regeneration in Hydra. We have done a little bit of work on cell signaling, which I told you, some work in DNA repair, and we have tried to introduce it as a teaching tool. The last frontier would be to find out how there is lack of organismal senescence in Hydra. And I think DNA repair and cell signaling both are going to play a very important major role there. I'll leave you with some pictures, which are essentially the perks of a scientist. You know, because of that, you can travel. Although last 1.5 years, it has not been possible, but this is one of the perks that I've enjoyed most. I think I'll stop there and take questions.
Thank you very much, Surendra. So I'm going to hand over to Ayanti and Sukriti, who are going to moderate the Q&A session. So go ahead.
Hello, sir. Thank you for the talk. This is Sukriti. Someone in the audience wants to know about your DNA repair work. You just mentioned it. So they've asked, what are the DNA damage insults faced by Hydra? And is there repair machinery similar like the triploblastic organisms?
Yeah, okay. So the DNA damage agents that they face are all that we face, especially in water, including UV. We started our work with irradiating Hydra with UV, and then we looked at the nucleotide exchange repair in Hydra. It has all the, so far we have studied the XP gene, xeroderma pigmentosum gene, XPA to XPG, everything is there. It has Cockayne syndrome A, Cockayne syndrome B. It has non-homologous end joining. In Saroj Gaskarbhi's lab, Komal has also looked at the base excision repair, and it has an AP1 enzyme there. So everything seems to be there. Interestingly, not only DNA repair proteins and genes, but also the signaling proteins and genes in Hydra are more similar to vertebrate counterparts, including humans, than Drosophila and Caenorhabditis. And as I mentioned earlier, we have seen that some XPA protein, for example, can rescue XPA deficient human cell line defect, and they are more resistant to UV. So we have looked at DNA repair. Unfortunately and very surprisingly, there is no other lab which is looking at it, because it's a very important aspect of biology, and I think it will give us some answers about the longevity and regeneration ability of Hydra. You can look up the review article if you want. There are many basics about DNA repair and also our work there.
Thank you, sir. I hope this answers their question. Someone has asked, you talked about Hydra regeneration, and you started with Hydra regeneration, cutting it into half. Someone wants to know, what are the smallest number of cells from a Hydra that can form a new Hydra?
So the entire Hydra is made up of 100,000 cells, but so far the report of the smallest number of cells is just 100 cells. But there must be some eye cells within those 100 cells so that it can regenerate fully. So just about 100 cells. But generally we take a few hundred cells and can regenerate, and this has been done also quite consistently in INSTEM in Bangalore.
All right. I think people are extremely interested in the DNA repair. So there's one more question on this. What are some aspects that are suspected to be involved in the lack of senescence in Hydra? And what you spoke about DNA repair and constant regeneration. Are there any other factors?
I think, in my opinion, the cells are getting replaced, and that must be the main reason behind regeneration, because that is also the reason why you don't get many mutants in Hydra, and making a transgenic Hydra is also very difficult. And no wonder that is why people have turned to other model systems which are easier to work with, in the sense that you can make transgenic lines, you have so many mutants and so on. So Hydra gives very spectacular phenotypes, but it's a very hard organism to work with. But I guess that, and we have shown in one of our studies that XPF, the new endonuclease, is predominantly expressed in the eye cells rather than in the epithelial stem cells. So it looks like, it has a role in maintaining the germline there. but we have been able to do only so much. So there is a lot to be done.
Thank you, sir. I'll now hand over the mic to Ayanti, who will ask you more questions.
Hi. So we have an anonymous attendee who's asked if there are heterogeneities in the mesoglial components and if there is localized deposition when the head and foot regeneration occurs.
Heterogeneity is in the sense molecular, I suppose. So mesoglia is made up of all these different kinds of ECM components. And the mesoglia is established when the regeneration takes place. So I don't know whether that answers the question. What was the second part you said?
Is there localized deposition when head or foot regeneration is happening?
Well, we know that for foot regeneration, matrix metalloproteinases are more important than head regeneration. So I guess there are, but I don't think it has been dissected carefully.
I see. There's another question about possible evolutionary significance of the whole lack of senescence aspect of hydra that you talked about. So
see, regeneration also, as organisms become more and more complex, regeneration ability has also gone down. For example, if we can regenerate only our liver and some other parts to a little extent. Likewise, you don't see, planaria of course can regenerate also, but the lack of senescence, the question, I don't know, I think it is because of the turnover of the cells, which really doesn't happen in complex organisms. We age because our cells also age. We know that cellular aging happens, and that probably adds to organismal aging, but that is not seen in hydra. So it is potentially immortal. There has been a study on some unfortunate PhD student was given a hydra polyp to find out what is its longevity. And after 4 years, after the hydra polyp refused to die, his PhD problem had to be changed. But there was a paper a few years back in Nature wherein they had built an algorithm based on trees and various organisms, wherein they predicted that a hydra polyp would be able to survive for about 10,000 years. I don't think any one of us will be there to confirm that.
Right. So a final question. So you talked about how cells are constantly proliferating. How does the organism account for its size then? I know you mentioned turnover, but it must be very tightly regulated for it to maintain a constant size.
And you can actually, as soon as you feed it more, it produces more cells and there is more body. So the hydra size does not change. It just goes on giving more and more buds. That's how we actually make more hydra if we need it in larger numbers. So we control it with food. Yeah.
That's all from the questions. Thank you.
Thanks, Ayanti and Kriti. There's a few questions still in the Q&A, and so I'm going to invite Manish and Kiran to join us in the spatial chat room after this. I put the link in the chat box. Sonia, I'm going to hand it over to you.
Sounds good. So absolutely fantastic talk, Suren. Just wonderful to go through the history of developmental biology and how much teaching actually has happened through doing developmental biology in India. It was fantastic. Thank you for that. So what my job is to give everyone an idea of all of the things that are to come. So I'm just going to quickly share my screen.
There are some questions in the question answer thing. We want them to be tackled.
What did we decide, Raj? Did we say that was it for question answers, and when we would move those the two that are remaining to the spatial chat room, or
yeah, I invited Manish and Kiran.
Okay, so there's going to be another session. Yeah.
To hang out and
to hang. Yeah. Okay, so again, we call ourselves the Bangalore Developmental Biology Club, but really it's only because it's run by a bunch of us in Bangalore, but it's really open to anyone who's interested in developmental biology. And as we've seen from the last few sessions, really people do join us from all over, not just India, but the world over. So, I just always feel like I need to, maybe we need to drop the word Bangalore from this, but we'll think about that. So yeah, so basically we're now, oops, my slides are not moving. So we're now moving into some new activities from the DevBio Club. And so I'm going to tell you about the WIPs. So if you remember, we had said that the BDBC activities would have the seminar series. You're attending the second one of them, and this would happen every second Friday of the month. So we had Scott Gilbert. Today we had Suren giving us this talk, and we have some very exciting other speakers as well. Nipam Patel, Bob Goldstein, Mansi Srivastav, Catherine Dulac, Denny Dubélé, and very many more. So there's a lot of exciting talks coming through. So do stay tuned for those, and we'll advertise them as they come up. But we'd also said that the other activity that actually precedes this avatar of the BDBC are the symposia, which have been happening for, I think, 3 years now. And so last month we had one of those, and the next one of those symposia format of talks will be in October. So do watch out for that. But we'd also promised that we would have these other 3 activities, the work talks on the first Friday of the month, the pre-review journal clubs on the third Friday of the month, and the general chill out hangout sessions on the fourth Friday. But those, the fourth Friday events certainly are not happening anytime soon. But what we did want to start off now, since there's so much excitement and so much participation, are the work talks. So we've actually rechristened it because we didn't want to give the impression that this should be a refined piece of a story, piece of research that you're ready to send out, because we really wanted to be a work in progress seminar series. And this is because of what we would like the scope of this activity to be. So the first thing is that we want to provide a space where you feel like you can bring the rough cuts of your stories that you are developing, to get feedback, to trial your ideas, to clarify your thoughts, to organize your thoughts and get feedback from the community. So we really do want it to be something that focuses on a lot of discussion. And so we will make sure that this series will make a lot of time for discussions to occur. And because we know that intellectual sparks fly only when the atmosphere is informal, what we will do is we will try and simulate, until we can meet in person, the feeling of a hangout, so that you can, break away from the formal presentation and chat with each other. And so after today's session, we're going to trial this out. But the purpose of this is that, when you have it in a Zoom format like this, you'll have 2 people who dominate the discussion and the rest have ideas, but don't know where to put them out. So hopefully this format will get rid of that. You can have people break away and have conversations in parallel and not have them interfere with each other. So that's the other advantage of having this sort of a format. And then, of course, everyone's tired of Zoom. We know that, and we need to lighten the air. So at this sort of forum, we're hoping that you'll feel free to bring your beverage of choice and really relax and talk about the things that you've heard in the previous in the talks. So how do we go about doing this? Really, it's a forum for you. So if you are thinking about this as something that you'd want to use, then do please get in touch with us. You can DM us on our Twitter handle, which is DevBio Club. You can use the Slack channel. There's a channel dedicated to this. It's called Work Talks, and I unfortunately can't change the name. I should probably just delete it and start a new one. But you can use this. I've given it a description that says work in progress. So if you can ping us there as well. if you want to, or give us a DM on Slack as well if you want to if you want to present at the series. You can also send any of us an email, and we'll draw up a roster. And so finally,
I can't help you search mail on Apple Watch.
I'm sorry. So finally, I think Raj has dropped a link to something called Spatial Chat in the chat box in Zoom. So whoever's interested in hanging out and trying out this format for the work talks, or even just catching up with Suren for the questions that you had that couldn't be answered in the Zoom session, do please head over there. I'm going there in 30 seconds.
Thank you, everyone. See you in the lounge bar.